The rain hammered against the hospital window as Emma sat frozen, clutching a crumpled envelope in her trembling hands. Inside was a letter she'd written 5 years ago, a confession of love she'd hidden in the pages of an old book, never expecting anyone to find it. But someone had, and now, as she stared at the man lying unconscious in the hospital bed before her, she realized with devastating clarity that some words, once written, have the power to change everything. If you believe in second chances and the courage it takes to speak the truth, stay with us until the end of this story. And if emotional journeys like this touch your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Emma Morrison had always been the quiet one, the girl who observed from the corners of crowded rooms, who felt everything deeply but expressed very little. At 23, fresh out of college, she'd taken a job at a small architectural firm in Boston, grateful for the stability and the chance to fade into the background of office life. That's where she met Daniel Fletcher. Daniel was everything Emma wasn't, confident without being arrogant, charismatic in a way that made everyone feel seen, and passionate about his work in a manner that was infectious. He had this habit of running his fingers through his dark hair when he was concentrating, and his laugh could brighten even the dreariest Monday morning. Within weeks of starting at the firm, Emma found herself hopelessly, quietly in love with him. But Daniel had a girlfriend. Vanessa was beautiful, successful, and perfectly suited for him in ways that Emma knew she could never be. They'd been together for 3 years, and everyone at the office whispered about an impending engagement. Emma told herself it was enough just to work alongside him, to share coffee breaks and discuss blueprints and sometimes stay late working on projects together. She convinced herself that loving him from a distance was a gift in itself, even if it hurt. One particularly difficult evening, after a day where she'd watched Daniel and Vanessa have lunch together outside the office, Emma went home and did something she'd never done before. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat at her small kitchen table, and wrote Daniel a letter. Not to give him, never to give him, but just to release the feelings that were suffocating her from the inside out. She wrote about the first time she'd seen him, how he'd held the door for her and smiled like she mattered. She wrote about the way he explained architectural concepts with his hands, painting pictures in the air. She wrote about the sound of his voice, the kindness in his eyes, way he remembered small details about people that others overlooked. She wrote about loving him wholly and completely, knowing that love would never be returned. And she wrote about accepting that truth, about finding beauty in loving someone even when they belong to someone else. When she finished, tears streaming down her face, Emma folded the letter carefully and slipped it inside her favorite book, a worn copy of The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, a novel about impossible love and the roads not taken. She placed the book on her shelf, hidden among dozens of others, and tried to move forward. 5 years passed. Emma remained at the firm, watching as Daniel and Vanessa got married in a beautiful ceremony she attended with a practiced smile. She dated occasionally, even had a relationship that lasted nearly a year, but nothing ever felt quite right. Daniel became a senior partner. They remained friends, good friends, the kind who could talk about anything except the one thing that mattered most. Emma learned to live with the ache, the way one learns to live with an old injury that flares up in certain weather. Then 3 months ago, everything changed. Vanessa filed for divorce. The news rippled through the office like a shockwave. Daniel became withdrawn, throwing himself into work with a desperation that worried everyone who cared about him. Emma watched from her familiar distance, wanting to help, but not knowing how, not trusting herself to get too close to his pain when her own feelings remained so complicated. 2 weeks ago, Daniel announced he was moving to Seattle. A major firm had offered him a position, and he'd accepted. It was time for a fresh start, he said. Time to leave behind the memories and begin again. The office threw him a farewell party. Emma gave him a gift, a leather portfolio for his designs, and a handshake that lasted a moment too long. She thought that would be the end of it, the final chapter of her quiet, unrequited love story. But Daniel didn't leave on schedule. He'd planned to spend his last weekend in Boston packing up his apartment. But instead, he decided to clean out his storage unit first. Among the boxes of college textbooks and old furniture, he found a collection of books he'd borrowed from Emma years ago, books he'd forgotten to return. One of them was The Age of Innocence. Later, Daniel would tell her that he'd sat on the floor of that dusty storage unit and opened the book randomly, just remembering how passionately Emma had talked about it. That's when the letter fell out. That's when he read words that rewrote his entire history. He'd driven straight to Emma's apartment, the letter in his hand, his heart pounding. But Emma wasn't home, so he'd waited, sitting on the steps of her building in the October chill. When she finally arrived, carrying groceries and humming to herself, he'd stood up, and she'd seen his face. She'd known immediately what he'd found. They talked for hours that night. Daniel read passages of the letter aloud, his voice breaking, asking her why she'd never said anything. Emma tried to explain the timing, Vanessa, the impossibility of it all. Daniel revealed his own truth, that his marriage had failed partly because he'd always felt something was missing, a connection he couldn't name. That Emma had been the person he looked forward to seeing each day at work. That he'd convinced himself his feelings were just friendship because anything else seemed wrong when he was committed to Vanessa. They'd had 3 weeks together. 3 weeks of discovering that the feelings Emma had nurtured in silence were actually shared. 3 weeks of coffee dates that turned into dinners, of long walks through Boston Common, of conversations that lasted until dawn. 3 weeks of Daniel canceling his move to Seattle, of Emma finally understanding what it meant to be loved the way she'd always loved him. 3 weeks of believing that, sometimes against all odds, the universe grants second chances. Then came yesterday. Daniel was driving to meet Emma for lunch when another car ran a red light. The collision was severe. Internal bleeding, head trauma, broken ribs. The doctor said the next 48 hours were critical. Emma had sat by his hospital bed all night, holding the hand of the man she'd loved for 5 years. The man she'd only just begun to really know, and prayed to anyone who might be listening. Now, as the rain continued its relentless assault on the window, Emma pulled out a pen and another piece of paper. If Daniel had found one letter by accident, maybe he should have another by design. This time, she wouldn't hide it. This time, she'd tell him everything she'd learned in their brief time together. She wrote about how loving him had taught her that the heart has infinite capacity, that feeling deeply isn't weakness but strength. She wrote about the joy of finally being seen after years of invisibility, of having her hand held and her thoughts valued. She wrote about the conversations they'd had about renovating an old Victorian house together, about the trip to Italy they'd planned, about the ordinary, beautiful future they'd imagined. But mostly, she wrote about gratitude. Gratitude for 3 perfect weeks. Gratitude for every moment they'd shared, even the painful ones when she'd loved him in silence. Gratitude for the chance to tell him the truth before it was too late. And if it was too late, if these were the last words she'd write to him, she wanted him to know that loving him had been the defining experience of her life, and she wouldn't trade a single moment of it, not even the heartbreak. As Emma signed her name, she heard something. A rustling sound. Her head snapped up to see Daniel's eyes flickering open, his gaze unfocused but searching, finding her. "Emma," he whispered, his voice rough and weak. She dropped the letter and grabbed his hand. "I'm here. I'm right here." "The letter," he managed. "Your letter changed everything." Tears spilled down Emma's cheeks. "It was never meant for you to find. It was me trying to make peace with loving you." Daniel's grip tightened slightly on her hand. "Best accident that ever happened to me." He coughed, wincing. "Emma, I need to tell you something. Don't talk. Save your strength." "No, important." His eyes locked on hers with sudden intensity. "That day, when I found your letter, I sat in that storage unit and cried. Not because you loved me, because I'd been so blind. Because I'd wasted so much time." Emma shook her head. "We found each other. That's what matters. I wrote you a letter, too," Daniel continued, his breathing labored. "The night before the accident, telling you that I'd never believed in soulmates until I read your words, that I'd been looking for you my whole life without knowing it, that moving to Seattle was me running from the scariest, most wonderful thing that ever happened to me." "Where is it?" Emma asked. "My apartment, kitchen table." "Emma, if I don't." "Stop. Don't say that. If I don't make it, promise me you'll read it. Promise me you'll know that these 3 weeks with you were worth everything, that I loved you. That I love you." "You're going to tell me yourself," Emma insisted, her voice fierce through her tears. "You're going to recover, and we're going to have our life together. We're going to renovate that Victorian house and go to Italy and have 1,000 more conversations until dawn. We're going to have years, Daniel, not 3 weeks. Years." A slight smile crossed Daniel's lips. "Bossy, I like it. I learned from the best architect in Boston. Second best," he corrected. "You're brilliant, Emma. I should have told you that years ago. Should have told you so many things." A nurse entered then, followed by a doctor, and Emma was ushered out of the room. She paced the hallway for what felt like hours but was only minutes. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was cautiously optimistic. Daniel was stable. The worst had passed. He'd need surgery and months of recovery, but he was going to live. Emma collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with relief. A volunteer brought her water and a blanket. She sat there, wrapped in warmth, holding her unfinished letter, and thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. All those years of silent love, of believing her feelings were something to be hidden and managed. The courage it had taken to write that first letter, even never intending anyone to read it. The accident of Daniel finding it. The 3 perfect weeks that followed, and now this second chance that felt like grace. She thought about all the people who loved in silence, who believed their feelings were unrequited or impossible. She thought about how close she'd come to never knowing that Daniel felt the same way. How easily this story could have ended differently with him in Seattle. Her still in Boston, both of them wondering what might have been. 3 days later, when Daniel was awake and alert, Emma brought him his letter from his apartment. They read them to each other. 2 confessions of love that had finally found their audience. They laughed and cried and marveled at the strange paths that hearts take to find each other. 6 months later, on a spring morning with cherry blossoms blooming throughout the city, Emma and Daniel stood in front of that Victorian house they talked about. It was dilapidated and would take years to renovate, but it was theirs. As they walked through the empty rooms, planning and dreaming, Daniel pulled out a small box. "I know we're doing everything backwards," he said. "We fell in love before we dated. We said, 'I love you' in letters instead of in person, and we bought a house before we got engaged. But Emma Morrison, will you marry me?" Emma looked at the man she'd loved for so long, the man who'd found her hidden truth and had the courage to act on it, the man who'd survived an accident that could have stolen their future, the man who taught her that love, even when it seems impossible, is always worth the risk. "Yes," she said simply. "Always yes." They married that summer in a small ceremony in the garden of their slowly renovating Victorian house. Emma wore her mother's dress, and Daniel wore a suit with a pocket square that matched the color of the cover of The Age of Innocence. Instead of traditional vows, they read excerpts from their letters to each other, the words that had been written in pain and hope, and had ultimately changed everything. As Emma stood there holding Daniel's hands and promising him forever, she thought about that girl. She'd been 5 years ago writing her heart out in a letter she thought no one would ever read. She wished she could tell that girl that the risk of loving, even in silence, is always worthwhile. That words have power, even when unspoken, and truth finds a way to surface. That the timing might seem wrong, the circumstances impossible, but real love is patient enough to wait for its moment. The story of Emma and Daniel spread through their circles, becoming the kind of tale people tell when they want to believe in magic. Friends would ask Emma if she regretted all those years of silence, all that time spent loving him from a distance. She always said no. Every moment of that journey, even the painful ones, had been necessary. It had taught her about the depth of her own heart, about resilience and hope, and it had made their eventual coming together all the more precious. They did eventually make it to Italy, wandering through Florence and Rome, visiting architectural marvels and tiny cafes. They finished renovating the Victorian house, turning it into a home filled with books and laughter and love. They adopted a dog they named Edith, after Edith Wharton, and they kept every letter they'd ever written to each other, stored carefully in a box in their bedroom, a reminder that words matter and truth transforms in love when it's real, finds a way. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Emma would take out that original letter, the one Daniel was never meant to read, and marvel at how a single act of honesty, even a private one, could change the trajectory of a life. She'd learned that speaking our truth, even to ourselves, is a revolutionary act. That love doesn't always need to be declared to be real, but that when it finally is declared, when we find the courage to be vulnerable and open, the world shifts in ways we can't imagine. Their story reminds us that there's no such thing as wasted love, no such thing as feelings that don't matter just because they're not immediately returned. Every moment we spend loving, even in silence, shapes us into people capable of deeper connection. And sometimes, against all odds, the universe conspires to give us exactly what we've always hoped for, in exactly the way we need it most. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to be brave with your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that love, in all its forms, is never a mistake. And remember, the words you're afraid to say might be the very words someone else is waiting to hear. Don't let fear silence the truth of your heart, because somewhere, somehow, the love you keep hidden might be exactly the love that changes everything.